move on to some of the negotiation tactics. Both parties to a CBA have several negotiating tactics available to them. For example, owners can implement lockouts to prevent players from competing within the league. We've recently seen that by the NFL and currently in the NBA. Owners can also use replacement players, which was done in the NFL in the 1980s, and baseball for a brief time had replacement players in the 1990s. Players have their own negotiation tactics, such as going on strike, threatening to play overseas, decertification, like we discussed, and maybe even starting their own league, which was mentioned by some of the NBA players recently. What are your thoughts of these different negotiation tactics?
Well, I think the first thing, Caleb, is, if you analyze sports, which is difficult to do sometimes, in conjunction with our federal labor laws, basically every action or right that one side in the collective bargaining process has, the other side has an equal or similar right. So when Caleb was just mentioning all the different tactics that each side has used over the years, whether those have been strikes, whether it's been utilizing lockouts and replacement players and things like that, all of those have their derivation in the federal labor laws. The National Labor Relations Act, which was initially created in 1935, has certainly had a lot of changes to it over the years, and its application in sports is sometimes trying to put a square peg in the round hole, but it certainly is what is the basis for all of these different tactics that the parties can use. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the NFL, for example, and I'm sure Travis will speak on this in a minute, there was not much discussion this year when there was a fear that some of the games would be lost of using replacement players, because that legal right that the NFL had was really viewed as a dismal step that they made when they did take those steps several years ago. And I think it made everyone angry, and it certainly wasn't a success. I think what's interesting now, if you're looking at the NBA, is a counterbalance to what we saw in the NFL. As I said, the NFL initiated their decertification process almost simultaneously with the expiration of the collective bargaining agreement. And as Darren mentioned, now we're seeing the NBA that has already lost a month of its regular season. That Players Association is now saying, well, if things don't go well today with the federal mediator, we might utilize the decertification process and start some type of an antitrust action. Clearly, as Darren said, I think if that happens on Monday, we are at an Armageddon stage, because I think that will certainly indicate that we're not going to have an NBA season for this year. But I think tactically, which was what Caleb's point was, I think it's very interesting how the NFLPA used that tactic of decertification under the labor laws to allow them to utilize the antitrust system simultaneously with the expiration, where the NBA now has waited and is threatening to utilize that as a method of leverage or creating leverage for them, with already 1 month of the regular season canceled, which means lost pay of 1 month for all of the players in the NBA. So I think that's the issue there, Caleb. That's interesting to watch.
Well, to add to that, I mean, decertification, I think, is an interesting tactic that I don't know if it really worked the way the Players Association wanted it to work in the NFL case. I think if you look at decertification occurred in March, and we had an appeal, and I think a final an opinion in July, and then we came to an agreement at the end of July. That's a fast track, as you all probably know, to get an opinion out of the 8th Circuit. So they had a district court ruling on a TRO, and then they had that decision appealed and then an opinion issued in that amount of time, and then they ultimately resolved the agreement. And I think what you were dealing with in the NFL were players that don't have guaranteed salaries and were really on the brink of starting to lose game checks. And the NFL teams knew that, and they had a lot of leverage after that 8th Circuit opinion. And if you recall, the temporary, the TRO went the players' way. They granted a TRO for the players to stop the lockout. That enabled the players for a short period of time to get back to work. It was quickly reversed and then appealed, and ultimately we had our decision. But again, going back to, I really feel, in my opinion, it really hurt the players, because it took negotiations off the table. Once it began to get litigated in court, you stopped to have the negotiation sessions occurring on a daily or weekly basis between the union and the teams, and that really hurts, because as you guys all know, you really need to have those face-to-face discussions to work out those issues. So it took 3 months off the table. Then we had the 8th Circuit really deciding in favor of the NFL, and then quickly we had to get a deal done because teams were going to start, or players were going to start losing money. Now in the NBA, you have kind of the opposite. You have a lot of players that there's guaranteed money, and you have players that are making a higher base salary. I'm just curious if you know, now there's been a lockout for a few months. If they do decertify, does it flip? Is it now in favor more of the players? Because now the teams perhaps are the ones really, I think, as you said, potentially losing an entire season.
Well, players were making their guaranteed money up until Monday when they started forfeiting their checks from this season. So I think that changes things. One major difference between the NFL player situation and the NBA player situation is the marketplace. In the NFL, the players, what were their options? To go play for the United Football League? In basketball, many of these players have open markets overseas. So they can say that based on this lockout, they're prevented from practicing their trade and making money, perhaps not as much money. But that's still, they don't have the same argument that NFL players had. And I think that's where the cases really are different between the NFL and the NBA. Now, it'll drag on no matter what. If they do decide to file such a claim, I'm just not quite sure that they'll be happy with the result.
I think one other thing I'd like to add too, from what Travis was saying, which I think is really crucial. In the NFL, well, in all collective bargaining agreements, at the end of the day, there's not any court in the United States of America that's going to mandate the terms of a collective bargaining agreement when it comes to professional sports. So ultimately, the sides are going to have to sit down and meet face to face and come to some resolution. And I think that was one of the challenges in the NFL. There was no track record or history. It was Commissioner Goodell's first collective bargaining agreement as a commissioner. It was DeMaurice Smith's first collective bargaining agreement as the head of the Players Association. So I think there was, unlike some of the predecessor negotiations, which again were criticized because perhaps the sides were too chummy and too friendly, I think this go round, that was an interesting challenge because they didn't have that history of having worked together prior to this negotiation to look back upon or to learn from. And I think, frankly, and I think Kay will probably agree with me, I think that's one of the things right now in Major League Baseball is the relationship, while certainly not friendly in the sense of let's go be buddies, but there's a professional respect, and everyone has a great deal of respect for Rob Manfred, who's handling the negotiations on the management side, as well as for Michael Weiner. And I think that history always really helps when it comes time to try and get a deal done.
I completely agree with that point. If you look at the background for the folks involved with the NFL lockout, you know, DeMaurice Smith was a partner at a Washington, D.C. law firm. He was brought in to litigate this issue and to run this litigation. I mean, that's what was his job and his charge, and he did it well. On the other side, you had a career lawyer at the NFL who was commissioner, and he knew it was going to be a tough job. So you did have two people brought in specifically for the lockout, to manage the lockout, and they did not know each other, and they were both jockeying to make sure that their membership approved of what they were doing. And I think that is a difficult issue, and they had to come out and look competitive on both sides. And I think you do in baseball, I think, have that advantage of maybe that's not the issue. You can really get down to brass tacks.
One other important distinction, Kelly, before too, in the NFL, it's a lot easier, I think, ultimately to reach an agreement when the pie is big. And what I mean by that, most, if not all, franchises in the NFL, thanks to the lucrative collective bargaining, lucrative television revenue, are in a plus status. They're making money as organizations. Depending upon who you listen to, whether it's David Stern or reports, there are a number of teams, I'll use that term, a number of teams in the NBA that are not making money. There are a few who are making a lot of money, but there are a number of them who are not making any, if not losing considerable amounts of money. So I always think it's more challenging in a collective bargaining context when you're trying to figure out how to improve something that's damaged. And what I mean by that is you have a losing proposition for a number of these teams. So for some of them, as we saw in baseball years ago, let's lock the doors for a while. We're not really going to lose any more than we're already losing, is the mindset, although that might not be accurate when you think of the PR value. But certainly that is another distinction between the NBA and the just completed NFL negotiation.
Okay, before we move on to the next subject, I wanted to get your thoughts, if you have any, regarding decertification. And, you know, even though, you know, the unions have the legal right to do so, you know, many argue it's kind of a sham movement, if you will, because what happens as soon as they come to a deal, they recertify and form a union. So again, they have the legal right to do so, but what are your opinions about that?
Well, I think, and I don't let Darren speak, but I think it was one thing that was interesting in the NFL, which I'm sure Travis can speak to more than I can, but there was a clause in the last collective bargaining agreement that frankly prohibited the league from challenging if they decided to decertify as a sham. So it was something that I think both sides had anticipated and put it in the prior collective bargaining agreement. If you want to read it, it's very interesting language how it was drafted, which would stop the owner's side from claiming that the decertification was a sham. So I think obviously it was a concern, and it was certainly something they thought about in the last agreement.
And to add to that, I think, and I'm not a labor lawyer, but there are certain criteria that you need to meet to decertify. In the NFLPA, they followed through with those criteria. They delivered their notice, they took a vote, they followed the steps, and I'm not clear or can remember the exact steps they had to follow, but if you look at the steps, they followed the steps. And I think if you start really trying to peel apart those steps, it's just going to be a slippery slope. I think it's a really tough argument to win, and you saw the different opinions. I mean, the district court had one opinion, the appellate court had another, and who knows what would happen if we didn't come to a collective bargaining agreement. But I do think that that is a tough argument to prove that someone did a sham decertification, because although easy, and you do get the trade association emails as if they were a union, they took all the steps and acted as if they weren't. So I do think that is a tough line to cross.
I actually think it's harder now for the NBA to prove that it's a sham decertification, because it seems as though there may be a little bit of a divide in the membership of the NBA Players Association. You're reading reports about Derek Fisher and Billy Hunter not getting along. You're reading these reports about a group of agents that are trying to decertify, but then there's a lot of agents that think it's a bad decision. And players are saying, if my agent is in favor of decertifying, I'm going to drop my agent. So because of the fact that it seems there is this sort of divide, I don't think that you can necessarily say that it's a sham.